키토 다이어트를 하면서 근육을 키울 수 있을까요? 이런 질문이 자주 등장하는 이유는 일반적으로 키토제닉 식단은 간헐적 단식을 병행하기 때문입니다. 저도 하루에 2끼를 먹고 심지어는 한 끼만 먹는 분들도 많습니다. 그래서 삼시세끼에 단백질 보충제까지 챙겨 먹으며 운동하는 분들에게 이 방식은 근손실을 유발하는 식단으로 보일 수 있습니다. 하지만 실제로는 어떨까요? 내추럴 보디빌딩 프로였고 현재는 리프팅 세계 챔피언인 영양학 박사 레인 노트는 이 주제에 대해 관련 연구를 검토하며 다음과 같이 이야기합니다.
When the low carb diet kind of revolution came around a few years ago, there was a lot of claims being made about possibly low carb being superior for various forms of exercise since you were fat adapted, you could burn more fat, those sorts of things. And there was also pushback of people saying, whoa, 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 you need carbs for exercise performance. Carbs can be turned into glucose. Glucose can be stored as glycogen. Glycogen is important for exercise performance. So what does the research actually say about this kind of stuff? And what does it say about building muscle on low carb diets as well as strength gains? If we look at the evidence, what it seems to show is that if you're doing ultra endurance exercise, ketogenic or low carb diet appears to be just fine for that. That is because you are mostly burning fat during those sorts of exercise periods because it's low intensity. It doesn't have a high oxygen cost. And so for ultra endurance stuff, it appears to be fine. Now for regular aerobic exercise, it gets a little bit more dicey. If you're below 60% of your VO2 max, it appears to be okay. But once you start approaching 70% or greater of your VO2 max, we do start to see negative effects of low carb diets on performance. Now, I want to be very clear because somebody will say, well, my uncle's second cousin's best friend's dog sitter is a endurance runner and they do low carb and they run this race and they hit a PR on their time and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I can also find a guy who smoked every day of his adult life until he was 95 years old and then died because he got hit by a train. It doesn't prove anything. This is why we have these things called randomized control trials. When it gets over 70% of a VO2 max, what happens? You switch to a little bit more anaerobic systems for energy metabolism. Now, why is that important? Anaerobic means without oxygen. So it gets to the point where the oxygen cost is so great that you cannot deliver enough oxygen to the muscle in order for the mitochondria to be able to turn those fatty acids and acetyl-CoA into ATP and energy. And when that happens, you need glycolysis. Now, glycolysis is the metabolism of glucose, which does not require oxygen, and actually per unit of oxygen produces more ATP than fat metabolism. Now, per calorie ingested or per gram, fat produces way more ATP than glycolysis or glucose. But again, when you get to high levels of exercise, you're not worried about caloric density, those sorts of things, or energy density. What you're worried about is how much energy can you produce from the available oxygen you have. So again, glycolysis doesn't require oxygen, doesn't produce as much ATP as fat metabolism, but per oxygen cost or per oxygen unit produces more ATP. And glycogen also becomes extremely important during high intensity exercise. So the research is pretty clear. In high intensity exercise, over 70% of VO2 max, low carb or ketogenic diets do appear to negatively affect endurance, like time to exhaustion, as well as performance.
이 부분은 생소한 용어도 많고 여러분들에게 흥미롭지 않은 내용일 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 간단히 요약만 하고 넘어가겠습니다. 전속력으로 달리거나 순간적인 파워를 필요로 하는 경쟁적인 스포츠에서는 키토 다이어트가 적합하지 않을 수 있습니다. 하지만 일상에서의 신체 활동이나 조깅 같은 가벼운 운동을 할 때는 키토제닉 다이어트가 더 적합할 수 있습니다. 자세한 내용은 설명란의 링크를 통해 직접 확인하실 수 있습니다. 자, 이제 여러분들이 진짜 궁금해하실 만한 주제, 키토 다이어트와 근력 운동의 관계에 대해 알아보겠습니다.
What does the research say about gaining muscle mass or strength when on a ketogenic diet? So far, there's only really 2 good studies looking at this. And they're both done by the same lead researcher, Vargas. In one study, they equated calories and protein and looked at either a calorie protein matched ketogenic diet or a calorie protein matched non-ketogenic diet. What they saw was the ketogenic diet group actually gained a little bit less fat than the non-ketogenic group, but they gained significantly less lean body mass as well. So how do I explain this, since in weight loss studies, we don't see a metabolic advantage to ketogenic diets, or a fat loss advantage rather? Well, one possible explanation is that perhaps a ketogenic diet, while not advantageous for fat loss, may be advantageous for preventing fat gain during overfeeding. That's possible. I tend to think that what is more likely is, since this was a free living study, it's possible these subjects ate less because they felt more satiated on that low carb diet. Now that compounds the findings of the fact that those on the ketogenic diet gained less lean body mass, because if they did undereat, maybe that was why they gained less lean body mass. It was a pretty decent effect size between the groups in terms of lean body mass gain. How would I explain this mechanistically? Well, if the calories truly were equated, what's most likely, in my opinion, is that carbohydrates, while they do not increase muscle protein synthesis, they do decrease muscle protein breakdown. Insulin has a pretty powerful effect on inhibiting muscle protein breakdown, and the balance between synthesis and breakdown is what determines net protein anabolism. So my guess would be that by including carbohydrates in this diet, you're able to accrue more muscle tissue due to the fact that you're not only having an increase in protein synthesis from the dietary protein, but you're also having an inhibition of protein breakdown via dietary carbohydrate. Now,
제 개인적인 경험을 말씀드리면 키토 다이어트를 시작했던 초반에 저는 육류보다는 상대적으로 먹기 편한 계란을 많이 활용했었습니다. 그리고 지방을 먹기는 했지만 일반적인 키토 다이어트에서 제시하는 만큼의 양은 아니었던 것 같습니다. 기존에 먹던 식단과는 많이 달라서 자신에게 맞는 적정량을 찾는 것이 어렵게 느껴졌습니다. 그래서 초반에는 많이 먹어도 체중 증가의 위험이 적은 야채의 비중이 컸습니다. 그 결과 체중이 급격하게 줄어들었을 뿐 아니라 같은 강도로 운동했음에도 근육량이 많이 감소했었습니다. 이제 연구 결과를 살펴보겠습니다. 이 연구는 실험 기간이 8주로 아주 짧으며 케톤을 측정하는 방법으로 소변 검사를 사용했습니다. 하지만 소변에서 케톤이 검출되는 것이 키토 다이어트에 완전히 적응했음을 의미하지는 않습니다. 제 경험상 8주는 키토 다이어트에 적응하기에는 너무 짧은 기간입니다. 연구는 동일한 칼로리를 섭취하도록 설계했지만 연구자들도 실제로 두 그룹 간의 에너지 섭취량에는 차이가 있을 수 있음을 인정했습니다. 따라서 여러분이 키토 다이어트를 하면서 근육을 유지하고 싶다면 총 칼로리 섭취가 줄어들지 않도록 단백질과 지방이 풍부한 음식을 잘 섭취하셔야 합니다. 특히 다양한 종류의 고기와 생선, 계란 등 동물성 식품이 메인이 되어야 한다는 점 기억하시기 바랍니다. 저는 동물성 식품의 비중을 늘리고 단백질 섭취가 부족하지 않도록 식단을 조정하고 나서 단기간에 근육량을 회복할 수 있었습니다.
the other study Vargas did was not calorie matched, I don't think, but it was ketogenic versus non-ketogenic. So they looked at a few different metrics like counter movement jump, which is basically just like a standing high jump, bench press, and squat. The counter movement jump didn't show any difference between the two groups. Both bench press and squat were significantly lower in the ketogenic diet group compared to the non-ketogenic group. And when I say lower, what I mean is the relative increase of each. So people in the ketogenic diet group actually did not increase their bench press during this resistance training program, whereas the people in the non-ketogenic diet group did increase their bench press. Same token, both groups increased their squat, but the group that was on the non-ketogenic diet increased their squat significantly more than the ketogenic diet group. There could be multiple things at play affecting lean body mass. It may be not just the inhibition of protein breakdown, but perhaps these people are able to train harder because they have glucose and more glycogen available during their resistance training sessions, which, if you're doing like singles and doubles, that's not really going to tax glycogen very much because you can probably get by with what you have available ATP-wise as well as creatine phosphate. But once you start getting into like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 repetitions, you will be calling upon quite a bit of that muscle glycogen. And so it is possible that since the group that was ketogenic would have less muscle glycogen, and I'm speculating here, perhaps their resistance training sessions were not as effective. They couldn't create as much progressive overload because they were impaired in their performance. And that led to a lower accrual of strength over the course of this study compared to the non-ketogenic diet group. That being said, I need to have this important caveat because I know Some of you ketogenic diet Jedis will strawman what I'm saying and say, well, Lane says you can't gain muscle or strength on a ketogenic diet, and look at this guy who's super jacked on a ketogenic diet. You can absolutely gain strength and muscle mass on a ketogenic diet. Both these studies show that you could gain lean body mass and strength on a ketogenic diet. What I'm saying is it's likely not optimal for increasing your lean body mass. If your goal is just to be strong and muscular, you could probably do that on a ketogenic diet. But if your goal is to be the strongest, most muscular version of yourself you can possibly be, then the current data seems to suggest that a ketogenic diet may be suboptimal for that. Don't hate me, hate the data.
다시 한번 확실히 짚고 넘어가고 싶은 것은 두 연구 모두 8주의 짧은 기간 동안 이루어진 실험이라는 점입니다. 앞에서도 이야기했지만 8주는 키토 다이어트에 적응하기에 너무 짧은 기간입니다. 지방 대사 모드로의 적응은 최소 2주에서 몇 달, 심지어는 1년 이상 걸리는 경우도 있다고 합니다. 극단적인 카니보어 식단을 하는 숀 베이커 박사는 식단을 유지한 8년의 기간 동안 약 4kg의 근육량이 증가되었다고 합니다. 또한 그는 57세임에도 250kg의 중량으로 데드리프트를 하고 그가 가진 로잉머신 세계 기록을 매년 갱신하는 등 경이적인 운동 능력을 가지고 있습니다. 숀 베이커 박사도 그의 유튜브 채널에서 이 주제에 대해 다룬 적이 있으니 차후에 공유드리도록 하겠습니다. 하지만 저는 대체로 이 연구 결과와 레인 박사의 의견에 동의합니다. 저도 운동을 좋아하고 키토 다이어트를 하지만 이것이 근육을 늘리는 최선의 식단이라고 생각하지는 않습니다. 만약 여러분이 보디빌딩이나 특정 스포츠 대회에 참가하는데 키토 다이어트를 하는 것은 상당히 실험적이고 모험적인 일일 것입니다. 그런 선수들이 실제로 없는 것은 아니지만 아무래도 참고할 데이터가 너무 적은 것이 사실입니다. 마지막으로 우리는 한 가지 식단을 고수할 필요가 없으며 상황에 맞게 언제든 변경할 수 있습니다. 평소에는 키토 다이어트로 몸을 관리하다가 시합 며칠 전부터는 탄수화물을 섭취하여 근육 내 글리코겐을 비축할 수도 있습니다. 벌크업 기간에는 고단백, 고탄수화물 식단을 하다가 다이어트 기간에는 체중 감소에 유리한 키토제닉 식단을 사용할 수도 있습니다. 식단은 나의 상황에 맞게 활용하는 수단일 뿐이지 그것이 목적이 되어서는 안 됩니다. 식단이라는 것은 끝까지 믿고 따라야 하는 종교가 절대 아니라는 점 기억하시기 바랍니다. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.